Hello friends, welcome back to Medico Srinjoy. Today we'll start with a new topic, that is the mandible, which comes under the human general anatomy including embryology. Let us start with the dentist's favorite bone, that is the mandible. So friends, without wasting time, let's start the video. First we'll study the introduction part of the mandible. Mandible is also called the jawbone, and it is the lower jaw, so it forms the lower jaw. It is the largest and the strongest bone of the face, and it is the second bone to ossify after clavicle. So the first bone which ossifies is the clavicle, and the next bone which ossifies is the mandible. So this is the mandible of a adult human being. Now let's start with the parts of the mandible. So clearly this mandible is a U-shaped or horseshoe shaped bone. Now the parts of the mandible. Mandible consists of mainly three parts: one horizontal oriented part which is called the body, and the two vertical oriented rami. So friends, these two are the ramus, and the middle one which contains the teeth are the body. Next we'll study each of these parts in detail. First, let's start with the body. Mandible body have two surfaces, that is the external surface and the internal surface, and the two borders. These two borders are the superior border and the inferior border. The superior border is also called the alveolar border, and it bears the socket of the lower 16 teeth. So the alveolar process is the lower border, and which forms the socket of the 12 teeth. Now let's move on to the inferior border, also called the base of the mandible. So what does this contain? On the either side or near the median plane presents a small depression which is called as the digastric fossa. Let's see in the diagram. So we have the digastric fossa, something very important which generally comes in the viva table, that is what is the digastric fossa. So you can see in the diagram that these are the two digastric fossa. So let's that there are the two digastric fossa present in the inferior border of the body. This inferior border gives attachment to the anterior belly of the digastric muscle. It's a very important question, that is it gives attachment to the anterior belly of the digastric muscle. Next, move on to the features of the external surface of the body. Sorry friends, let's continue. The features of the external surface of the body are the symphysis menti. What is this symphysis menti thing? It's a faint median ridge on the external surface of the body. So symphysis menti is nothing but a faint median ridge on the external surface of the body. Also, it's a line of fusion of the two halves of the mandible at the 2 years age, and it expands below into the triangular elevation formed from the mental protuberance, that is the point of the chin. So there occurs a rectangular elevation which is called as a mental protuberance. Base of this side is the mental tubercle, and the inner aspect of the symphysis menti possesses 4 tubercle called the genial tubercle or the mental spines. So let's view in the diagram what is the mental protuberance and the mental protuberance. So let's see this. So this is the mental foramen, you can appreciate in the diagram. It's a mental protuberance, and here is a triangle portion which is the mental protuberance, and there is a mental foramen which you can appreciate in the diagram, and there is the symphysis menti or the line of the ridge. Next we'll move on to the next part, that is inner aspect of the symphysis menti. Okay, the inner aspect of the symphysis menti possesses 4 tubercles. These are called as the genial tubercles. Sorry friends again. Okay, let's continue. It is the genial tubercle. So we are studying the genial tubercle. Genial tubercle is arranged in the two pairs, the upper and the lower pair. The upper pair provides attachment to the genioglossus muscle, that is the upper pair provides the attachment to the genioglossus muscle, while the lower pair provides attachment to geniohyoid muscle. These two questions are very common in the viva, that is the upper portion provide the attachment to the genioglossus muscle, while the lower pair provides attachment to the geniohyoid muscle, and both these are called the safety muscles of the tongue. Comment below why these are called safety muscles of tongue, and I will answer the comment if you are wrong. Next we'll move on to the mental foramen. What does this mental foramen? It is present between the interval of the first and the second premolar teeth, and it provides the passage for the mental nerves and the vessels. So this is a very important. We have already appreciated the mental foramen in the diagram which is already shown. Next we may again see that the mental foramen, here we can appreciate the mental foramen, which is a small foramen in the base of the mandible. Next let's move on to the oblique line. What does this oblique line? It is a continuation from the anterior border of the ramus, and it runs downwards and forwards towards the mental tubercle. And what are the incisive fossa? These are the shallow depression just below the incisive teeth. Let's see this in the diagram. So you can appreciate that the mental foramen, it is the body, and here we get the oblique line, which is a faint line. And next we'll move on to the incisive fossa. What does this incisive fossa? Incisive fossa is nothing but a shallow depression just below the incisor teeth. Next we'll move on to the features of the internal surface of the body. First we have a mylohyoid line. Okay friends, this mylohyoid line is very important for the university exam purpose. So this mylohyoid line is a prominent oblique ridge. Okay, so this mylohyoid line is a prominent oblique ridge, and it runs downward and forward from behind the third molar teeth to the symphysis menti below the genial tubercle. So it is clear that it runs downwards and forward from behind the third molar, that is 1 centimeter below the alveolar bone, to the symphysis menti and below the genial tubercle. Next we'll study the mylohyoid groove. What are these mylohyoid groove? These mylohyoid grooves lie below the mylohyoid line, and the mylohyoid nerve and vessels runs in this groove. Next we have a sublingual fossa. You can appreciate all these structures in the diagram shown side by side. That is what is sublingual fossa. Sublingual fossa is nothing but a shallow line in the interior part above the mylohyoid line, and it lodges the sublingual gland. Okay, so this is a very important structure, that it lodges the sublingual gland. Next we have the submandibular fossa. What does this submandibular fossa? It's a hollowed area just below the mylohyoid line, and it lodges the submandibular gland. So it's clear that the sublingual fossa lodges the sublingual gland, and submandibular fossa lodges the submandibular gland. Next we will move on to the muscles of mandible. This is a very important 5-marker question often asked in the university exams. That is, what are the muscles of the body of the mandible? These muscles of the body of the mandible are the buccinator, mylohyoid, genioglossus, geniohyoid, anterior belly of digastric, platysma, and the superior constrictor. We'll have to learn these names by heart, that what are the muscles present in the body of the mandible. Friends, these muscles will be very important for your university exams and for your upcoming years. So please friends, study these muscles very carefully. So let's study these muscles one by one. What are the buccinator muscle? Buccinator muscle form the oblique line below the molar teeth, and the mylohyoid muscle arises from the mylohyoid line. Next, we have the genioglossus. This genioglossus muscle forms the superior genital tubercle, while the geniohyoid forms the genial tubercle. Next, sorry friends again, we are at the anterior belly of the digastric muscle. What are these anterior belly of the digastric muscles? This form the digastric fossa on the base of the mandible. So this form the digastric fossa. Next we have the platysma. The platysma muscles are inserted into the base, and the superior constrictor. This form the area above the posterior end of the mylohyoid line. Next, we move on to the next subpart of our today's lecture, that is the ramus of the mandible. What are these? These are the quadrilateral vertical plates, and they project upward from the posterior part of the body. You can appreciate the ramus in the figure provided. So let's start with the features of the mandible, that is the mandibular ramus. The features of the ramus. The features of the ramus first include it has two surfaces, the lateral surface and the medial surface, four borders, anterior border, superior border or the mandibular notch, the inferior border and the posterior border. Okay. So we have the four borders and two processes. These two processes are very important, that is the condylar process and the coronoid process. What are these coronoid process and condylar process do? This condylar process is a projection from the posterior part, and its upper end extends to the form the head. So its upper end extends to form the head. There is depression called the pterygoid fovea here. Next we have the coronoid process. So you can appreciate the coronoid process that is present in the here. Friend, you can see the coronoid process and condylar process here, the diagram. Let's study again the coronoid process. Coronoid process is a flattened triangular projection, as we already seen in the diagram. Next we have the mandibular foramen. What is this mandibular foramen? This mandibular foramen is located little above the center of the ramus, and it leads to the mandibular canal, which opens on the mental foramen and provides a passage for the inferior alveolar nerve and the artery. This mandibular foramen is very important, so let's study this again. This mandibular foramen is located little above the center of the ramus, okay, and it leads to the mandibular canal. Next we have lingula. First we have to appreciate in the diagram. So friends, we can see the lingula. These are clearly seen in the diagram. So let's study the lingula. Lingula is a tongue-like projection in the medial side of the ramus. Next we have to learn the muscles attached to the ramus. There are mainly four muscles. These are the masseter muscle, temporalis muscle, lateral pterygoid and the medial pterygoid muscles. What are these masseter muscles? These masseter muscles are inserted on the outer surface of the ramus, while the temporalis muscle is inserted into the coronoid process. So this temporalis muscle is inserted in the coronoid process, and the anterior border and the inner surface. Also, the lateral pterygoid muscles are inserted in the pterygoid fossa and the one in the front side, while the medial pterygoid is present in the present or to be more specific, inserted into the pterygoid fovea in the inner surface. Next we will move on to the ligaments attached to the mandible. There are mainly 5 ligaments attached to the mandible. These are the stylomandibular ligament, which attaches at the angle of the mandible. Next we have the temporomandibular ligament, which attaches neck of the mandible. Third we have the sphenomandibular ligament, which attaches lingula of the mandible. And fourth we have the pterygomandibular ligament. So this pterygomandibular ligament attached behind the last molar and the upper end of the mylohyoid line. Next we will study the nerves of the mandible. These are the following 7 nerves. These are the First nerve is a lingual nerve which runs on the inner surface of the body close to the mandible side and the root of the third molar teeth. Next we have the inferior alveolar nerve which enters the mandibular foramen and passes through the mandibular canal. Third we have the mylohyoid nerve which runs in the mylohyoid group. These are very easy as the names of the nerves and the groups are parallelly equal, so it is not very hard to remember these names. Fourth we have the mental nerve which comes out of the mental foramen. Fifth we have the nerves up to the masseter, which are the masseteric nerves which run to the mandibular notch. It is important to remember that the masseteric nerves runs to the mandibular notch. Sixth we have the auriculotemporal nerve which passes to the medial side of the neck, and seventh and the last one which have the marginal mandibular nerve which passes across the lower border of the mandible. So friends, if you like this content, you may download it from the description box. Link is provided in the description box. You may download this PDF for your future studies. Next we have the clinical anatomy, which will be our last topic today. What is the clinical anatomy? There are the mainly fractures of the mandible which are common. The mandible occupies a prominent and the exposed position in the facial skeleton, so it's commonly fractured in the violent injuries. There are many sides of the fractures. These fractures mainly are of three sides. First, at the neck of the mandible, which is the weakest part of the bone. Second, we had the angle of mandible. Here the curvature concentrates and the force of the blow. And third, we have the canine region of the body. Here, because the elongated root canine reduces the bone substance and makes the mandible weaker side here. So the canine region is the commonest site of the fracture. This line is very important to remember, that the canine region is the commonest site of fracture. So friend, this ends our today's video of the mandible. If this video are helping you, please subscribe my channel. Next we will study the mandible brother, that is the maxilla. These mandible and maxilla are very important. So friends, without wasting your time, let's study again in the next video. It is the maxilla. Thank you. Keep supporting.